Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Josh and today we're going to talk about the Panasonic S1 with the new firmware, Firmware 2.0, compared to the S5 to see which one will be more suited towards you and your work. First of all, it's worth noting why I'm actually making this video in the first place, and that's because I've had so many people ask me in the last week what camera they should get between the S5 and the S1. Of course, I recently made a video about the S1 and its fantastic new firmware, and now people are sort of sitting there scratching their heads like, should I get the S5 or should I just get the S1 instead? So in a bid to fix that, I'm giving you this video. I'm going to put a full index of timestamps at the top of the description so you can jump between what parts actually interest you in this video. So anyway, let's just get straight into it. Differences for video work. So of course, the big elephant in the room is the fact that the S1 can now shoot 5.9K internally and the Panasonic S5 cannot do that. Personally, I don't see this as a discerning factor as to why you should pick up the S1 over the S5, and I think there's many other aspects to both cameras that make it more worthwhile to purchase as opposed to this slightly higher quality of footage. To be honest, for me, the 4K in the S5 looks pretty amazing, very much like the 5.9K in the S1, and of course no one really has 6K monitors to be watching this back on anyway, so the real advantage to that 6K is being able to crop in on a 4K timeline. But to be honest, I don't really do too much of that, so I wouldn't let that be the deciding factor for me. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's do a more deep dive into the actual settings and features on each camera. Okay, here's an interesting one that no one's really spoken about, which I noticed when going through the menu systems on both the S5 and the S1, and that's the fact that you're limited to 8-bit on Cinema 4K 50p in the S5. However, you can do 10-bit Cinema 4K on the S1. Now don't worry, if you're doing standard 4K, which is 3840 by 2160 as opposed to the 4096 by 2160 that you get in the Cinema 4K, you can still do 10-bit on the S5 and the S1, but I just thought it's interesting how you can only do 8-bit Cinema 4K, so 4096 by 2160 on the S5, but you can do 10-bit on the S1. Again, I don't really know what this is about, but if you are someone that shoots primarily in Cinema 4K, that's definitely worth mentioning, even though you can still do the full 10-bit 50p in 4K on the S5 as well. The S5 has a master pedestal level, which was actually seen first in the GH5. The S1 doesn't have this feature, and if you don't know what that is, it basically allows you to set your shadow point in camera to make them even more faded and higher, sort of brighter shadows, as opposed to the more dark and crushed black shadows in camera, so you can get, you know, sort of like more sort of vintage and dreamy look straight in camera. I think Panasonic originally implemented this feature so that people could better match their footage with the Panasonic cameras to other brands. It's not a feature that I use, so therefore it's not a deciding factor between these two cameras, but I thought I'd let you know. So moving on to a feature that I actually use a lot in my video work, and that's something called live cropping. Now the S5 isn't the first camera of Panasonic's line to be able to do live cropping, but when I first found it I was like, wow. Essentially what it allows you to do is it allows you to basically do a keyframe in camera, if you like. So basically you can crop in on a 4K image and get a 1080p sort of delivered result afterwards, where basically you're able to sort of do pans and tilts and zoom ins and zoom outs, etc., but all in camera, so you don't have to do it in post. And it's actually a really nice thing for like product shots and all that sort of stuff, and that feature is not on the S1. So for me that's actually quite a big thing, because I do use the live cropping feature quite a lot on the S5, and that could be a thing that if you're used to using it on your other Panasonic body, that could be something that could potentially deter you from this one and make you go towards the S5. Okay, so moving on to something that the S1 has but the S5 doesn't, and that's actually a dual native ISO setting switch. So on the S1 you can actually switch your dual native ISO setting from auto or high or low, which means, I mean, in my understanding it means that you can sort of change when the dual ISO, so the next sort of gain channel kicks in sort of thing. So if you wanted to kick it in earlier, then you can change it to low, but if you wanted to kick in a little bit higher, then you change to high, of course. Now this is something you can't do on the S5, you're sort of limited to what the sensor already does automatically, and that is a base of 640 in Vlog, and then the second base is 4000 in Vlog for ISO settings, but you can actually change that in the S1. But for me, to be honest, it doesn't really make much of a difference, because the image coming out of both cameras is extremely clean even when you leave it on auto, so I wouldn't actually mess around with that too much, and I just let the sort of sensor do what it wants to do. Something else that I think is really good to mention is the battery life compared to the S5 and the S1. Now the S5 battery life is rated at 440 shots compared to the S1 that's rated at 380 shots, which means you actually get 40 more shots per charge. Now in the real world scenario, is this noticeable? I'd say yes. I do think that I get slightly better battery life out of the S5 compared to the S1, so for me that is another big win for the S5. Of course, the less you can change the batteries, the less annoying it is, so there you go. Okay, moving on to the differences for photography. So if you're a sports photographer, then the chances are that the S1 will be a slightly better fit for you. The reason being because it's slightly better weather sealed, it's a lot heavier, and it also has 9 frames a second burst rate shooting, which is comparative to the S5's 7 frames a second of burst shooting. So even though it's only another 2 frames per second for sports or fast moving photography, that could be the matter between getting the shot or not getting the shot. Now for me and my workflow, I don't really use burst that much, to be honest, so therefore the 7 frames per second has never felt too limiting for me on the S5. But if you are someone that really relies on having a really fast burst rate, then the S1's going to give you a slight edge on that. Okay, let's move on to the actual hardware differences of both the cameras. So first and foremost, let's talk about the viewfinder on both the S5 and the S1, since it's a massive sticking point for those who do use viewfinders a lot and are probably deterred away from getting the S5 because of this. The S5 has a EVF resolution of 2360K dots compared to the S1's EVF resolution, which is 5760K dots, I believe. So therefore the difference in resolution is actually massive between these two in terms of the EVFs. I think the EVF on the S1 is slightly brighter and bigger as well. So if you are someone that has your face constantly pressed up against your camera, then chances are the S1 will be a better fit for you. But to be honest, I use the EVF on my camera a lot, especially with the S5 and stuff. And that's both for photo and video. You know, when it's really bright outside and I don't have a monitor with me, then I would normally use the EVF for video stuff. And to be honest, I don't actually have an issue with the S5 EVF. I know it's one of those things where people sort of look at the spec sheet and go, it's got a really low resolution EVF for the age and spec of this camera. But to be honest, it's actually not a bad thing at all. And actually it's quite bright and it's quite big. So therefore you don't really notice it as much. In terms of the actual weight of the body, the S5 comes in at 714 grams and the S1 comes in at 1021 grams, which means that it's significantly heavier than the S5. Now for me, I do a lot of shooting on a gimbal, and I also do a lot of stuff where I'm walking around with a camera in my hand a lot. Like I absolutely love doing street photography and landscape photography where I like to travel light. So for me, that weight difference is actually quite a big deal, and I've got to say I do feel it after using the S1 for quite an extended period of time. Of course, I've been like spoiled by the S5's lightweight and stuff, and for me, I actually do prefer the lighter weight of the S5. Now, this can also be seen as a positive for the S1 though, because like I said earlier, the S1 does have better weather sealing, and that extra added weight will be a lot better if you are someone that does a lot of handheld shooting. The S5 has a 3-inch flippy screen, which has a resolution of 1840K dots, whereas the S1 has a 3.2-inch screen, which is vari-angle, not flippy, and that has a max resolution of 2100K dots. If I'm being completely honest, the 0.2 of an inch size difference between the two doesn't really bother me that much. I've never really thought that the screen size on the S5 is that bad. I'm actually really happy with the screen, and to be honest, I much prefer the screen implementation on the S5 too. I think having the flippy screen is really useful for everything from photo to video. It allows you to shoot in really weird and wonderful angles all the time, and while I do really like the implementation of screen design on the S1, I do think the S5 has the edge in this front. And although the S1 does have a 10% better resolution screen, realistically you can't see this when you're using it. I've never looked at the screen side by side and thought the S5 looked like a lower resolution, at least to my eyes, so therefore I think screen-wise, the S5 wins for me. Another physical difference between the S5 and the S1 is the fact that the S1 actually features a full-size HDMI port and the S5 only has a micro HDMI port. Now for me, this is probably one of the biggest differences between the S5 and the S1, and weighs quite a lot in the favour of the S1, because a full-size HDMI port is just so much more reliable and sturdy compared to a micro HDMI. Luckily, I've never had any issues with micro HDMI inputs, but I know many people have. It's just not as good as the full-size option. So if you are someone that rigs up your camera with monitors and stuff all the time, I mean, of course I use the S5 with monitors all of the time and I've never had any issues, like I said, but I would have more confidence if the S5 had a full-size HDMI to know that it's not going to get knocked and it's not going to get damaged really easily. So that's definitely a point in the favour of the S1. The S1 has a flash sync port and the S5 doesn't. So therefore, if you are a photographer that uses off-camera flashes a lot and needs to sync up those off-camera flashes, and the flash sync port is something that you use a lot with your current camera, then the S5 is definitely not for you, because the S1 is the only camera between these two that actually has this port. That's a pretty obvious one, but I thought I'd throw it in there anyway. Of course, another physical difference between these two cameras is the fact that the S1 has a top LCD screen, which is great for viewing battery life and what your current settings are without actually looking at the LCD screen. And this is a luxury and it's actually quite nice to have. But to be honest, I really look at the top LCD when I'm using the S1, and for me, it's one of those sort of give or take features. So therefore, that is not a factor that essentially make me decide between these two cameras. But if you are someone that really likes having a top LCD, then the S1 has one. Okay, now onto internal storage for both of these cameras. So the S5 has two SD card slots. One is UHS 2 compatible and one is just UHS 1 compatible. And the S1 has one UHS 2 SD card slot and then one XQD CFast card slot. A lot of people complain about the S1 not having two SD card slots because they see the XQD slot as a negative, probably because the cost of media for the CFast XQD card type is a lot greater than the cost of media for SD cards, and most people that have cameras normally have quite a few SD cards laying around. However, the CFast card slot is actually a lot quicker and those cards are a lot more reliable and robust, so therefore if you are someone that likes to offload your media really quickly, then of course the CFast is not going to be a downside for you. Personally, I'm impartial to this difference, and I think just having two card slots in itself is a great feature of both of them, regardless of what type of slot it is. But if you are someone that wants to shoot primarily with SD cards and not with anything else, then of course the S5 will be a better fit. So finally, my choice if I had to choose between these two cameras. With everything in mind that we've just spoken about, I do have a favourite camera between these two, and I do have one that I would personally choose over the other one, and that one is the S5. For me, the S5 just works a lot better for most of my applications. It's lighter, it's smaller, and it's great for gimbal work, and it can also be rigged up when you're using it handheld. I really like the flip LCD screen implementation on it, and even though it has a lower resolution EVF, I'm absolutely fine with the EVF on the S5 and it does the job just fine, so please don't let that be a sort of discerning factor between these two cameras. With that in mind, I do think that the S1 would be more suited to those who do prefer a bigger body and need those extra features, especially hardware wise, like the top LCD and the slightly higher resolution EVF and screen. But generally speaking, I think whether you get the S5 or the S1, you're going to be extremely happy with the quality that you get from either of them. The image that you get from either of these cameras is pretty much identical in terms of photo and video. The low light capabilities are pretty much identical, and they're extremely nice to use. They're both extremely ergonomic and they feel really good in the hand. So therefore, no matter what one you choose, you're going to have a very pleasant experience and you're definitely not going to regret it. It's just for me, if I did have the choice and I didn't have these two cameras right in front of me right now, then I'd be going for the S5. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it somewhat entertaining or useful, and if you did, then please consider subscribing. I will be making a lot of Lumix and Panasonic related content on this channel, so if you are into that, then make sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification, and hopefully I shall see you in the next video. Thank you.